Bridge is a multi-purpose utility module with three main functions. First, it can be used to take an incoming voltage and multiply it across three different outputs. You also have an option to amplify it by 5 times or attenuate it by 5 times. The switches in the middle, no amplification or attenuation takes place. The module also has a voltage-controlled crossfader. This fader has 2 inputs, a voltage control input, and an output. It can be used as a simple switch, as a voltage-controlled amplifier, or to create complex shapes and patterns. Below this is a mixer. The mixer has 3 inputs, a positive input, a negative input, which subtracts from the positive, and another positive input, which can also be inverted. While it may seem simple, Bridge has a lot of useful tricks up its sleeve. Let's explore some of them now. In this first patch, we'll look at what is probably the most common use for Bridge, which is taking a 5-volt CV source, typical on most audio synthesizers, dividing it by 5 so it can interface with the 1-volt standard of the LZX system. So here I have a very simple patch with a memory palace going into a visual cortex. I'm also using the Y output from the memory palace to key, so we just have a colored background. I dialed that purple in by just using the mix controls on the cortex. There's a slowly spinning shape, but it's not very dynamic right now. So what I'd like to do is take this Roland TB03 baseline and use it to control some parameters on this patch. First, let me get this baseline running. I can take the CV output, plug it into the first input on the bridge. This is going to take that 5-volt CV signal and divide it by 5 to make it more amenable to video synth standards. From there, I can take any one of the 3 outputs and plug it somewhere in the memory palace. So I'm going to go up to zoom, turn this all the way up. So now you can see, let me pull this down a little bit. So now you can see the shape changing size based on the notes that are coming out of the synthesizer. And if I hit stop, see it stop. So you can see as notes get higher in pitch, the zoom gets, the image zooms up. We could also take the gate signal from here and put that into the second input. Again, make sure we're switched to divide by 5. We could take that output into a secondary control, say the hue. So I turn that up. And so now every time a new note is being triggered, we're also seeing an adjustment of the hue in the image. There's some other things on the bridge we can take advantage of to make this effect more elaborate. So I'm going to take this output from the CV or note data, and I'm going to put that into the A input on the fader. I'm going to take the voltage control for the fader. I'm going to take a really slow LFO coming from a prismatic ray. Then I'll take the output of the fader and put that back into the zoom input. So what's happening now is I have my note sequence, which is modulating my zoom, but then I have a slow LFO that's basically opening and closing how much of that pitch information gets through. If I keep this really slow, it's going to just add a more dynamic effect, so that the zooming isn't as repetitive as the pattern. If I increase the rate, we'll start to see more dramatic effects coming from the LFO. I'm going to keep this slow for now. We can also do the same thing with the gate output using the mixer down below. So again, I'm going to take this output, switch it for the output of the mixer. I'm going to take this gate, put it into the positive input on this 3-channel mixer. I'm going to take a different version of the LFO and put this on the negative input. So now that pretty regular gate signal is getting subtracted by this LFO, which is going to give me a little bit more variation over time. And of course, Bridge also gives us multiple of these outputs. So I can take a different output of this CV source and go into different sources elsewhere on my system. And as I switch through different patterns on my baseline, I'll start to get different results. So now we're going to look at some of the utilities on the right half of the Bridge module. In addition to voltage scaling, Bridge also has a crossfader and a mixer. We'll look at how to use those in the context of shape and pattern generation. So in this patch, we're just using a few ramps and one prismatic ray, which is at a scrolling speed, to create all these different interrelated shapes. A great deal of the complexity in this patch is caused by the fader and the mixer on the Bridge. So let's show you how this works. To start, I'm going to take my H plus V ramp from the visual cortex and go into the A input in the fader. Take the H minus V ramp and go into the B input on the fader. I'm going to take the output of that into layer 1 of a color quartz. And so what you see now is just a representation of the A input. If I flip this switch up, you're going to see the B input. This just determines the behavior of the crossfader, whether it goes from B to A or from A to B. So next, I'm going to use a channel of the passage to control this crossfader. So by taking output 1, plugging it into the voltage control input, I can now use the bias control to fade between my A and my B inputs. Of course, this is going to be more interesting if I use some other source to do this for me. So I'm going to go with the in1 input on the passage and plug in a prismatic ray that's at a slow scrolling speed. And now you can see as I adjust the passage, this gives me fine control over that crossfader. So I can go from no effect at all to maximum crossfading. Speed that up a little bit. Now to make this a little bit more apparent, I'm going to use a doorway so we get a good hard shape. So I'll take the key out from doorway, and I'll take this fader output, put that into the source input. Now as we adjust the threshold, start to see a little bit of a more interesting shape. There we go. And again, as I change the controls on the passage, see what starts happening. So the next thing I want to do is take 2 additional ramps and start to plug these into the mixer. Then I'm going to take this mixer output, and eventually we're going to use this to voltage control the threshold of the keyer. This should give a little bit more complexity to our results. But right now, the ramps are too similar to the H plus V ramps I'm controlling in the crossfader. So the first thing I want to do is again use a passage. I'm going to plug both of these into the through input. And then I'm going to plug an LFO into the in input. Then we'll take both of these outputs, put them back into the plus and the minus inputs on the mixer. So again, this now gives me an additional level of control over the mixer, which doesn't have any input controls of its own. This is one thing Passage is really great for. And to add an additional layer of complexity, I'm going to take this mix output and put it into a staircase before hitting the threshold. So now I have a good amount of modulation and complexity going on my shape. By adjusting the controls on Passage, I can control the crossfader and the mixer on the bridge. Finally, I'll take another one of the staircase outputs, and I'll plug that into layer 2, so we get a little bit of a background color. And now by adjusting different parameters, I can get a wide variety of different shapes and patterns. So that's a basic example of how you can use the crossfader and the mixer on Bridge to create more intricate and modulated patterns and shapes. In this last patch, we're going to look at sort of a secret bonus feature of the Bridge. It can actually be used as a fairly sophisticated keyer. The way this works is by taking an input signal and amplifying it until it starts to clip. The clipped portion can then be used as a positive key. So I'm going to take an H+V ramp output from my visual cortex and plug it into one of the multiple inputs on the Bridge. I'll take the output, plug that into one channel on the visual cortex so you can start to see what's happening. So if I move the switch to 0, that's going to give us the basic ramp exactly as it appears out of the visual cortex. If I go to divide by 5, the ramp is going to be attenuated and functionally disappear. If I go to x5, we start to get clipping in the interior part of the image. To make this more interesting, I'll use a passage first. And this is going to give me control over where that keyer threshold exists. So now as I sweep through, you can see we're getting a very nice soft-edged key. I can also adjust the bias control. So to make this more fun, I'm going to use the colorize input on the visual cortex. Set that to spectrum mode. Again, you can start to see what this is doing. And then to make things even more interesting, I'm going to use the fader section of the Bridge in conjunction with this key. So I'm going to take the output, move it over to the output of the fader. And I'm going to take this same key image and use that as a voltage control for the fader. I have an animated pattern on the memory palace. I'm going to plug that into channel A of my fader. So now, as I adjust the settings on my passage, you can see that we are keying the pattern from the memory palace using that ramp. Next, I'm going to put in a background image. I'm going to use an output from the prismatic ray and plug it into the B input on the fader. So now we have the texture from the memory palace appearing in the positive section of the key, and the scrolling bar from the prismatic ray showing in the negative section. The final thing I'll do for this patch is take one of the other multiples of this ramp input and add that to the pedestal voltage control on the prismatic ray. This just gives me another level of modulation to play with and makes the shape more interesting. So now by adjusting the controls on the passage, I can get a wide array of different keying effects. And of course, changing the shape of the ramp will drastically change the entire patch. So this is actually not too different from how a doorway works. In fact, the basic principle is the same. Using the amplification section to set the threshold for your key, and then using a fader to apply foreground and background images based on that key. I hope you've enjoyed this quick lesson. And as always, please leave any questions or ideas for future videos in the comments below. Thanks for watching.